when it comes to early AR-15 history, no set of facts is as misunderstood, in my opinion, than those surrounding the powder change. People will point to the powder change being the root of all evils. They'll point to it being a lot of different things that were bad and wrong. However, most of the time that people have an opinion about the powder change, they've acquired it from somebody who had no idea or a very limited idea what they were talking about. In order to really understand the scope, the reasons, the motivations, and the facts behind the powder change, we have to take at least one step back, understand the history a little bit better, understand the mechanics of the gun a little bit better, and then introduce all of the contemporary evidence. If you don't know, I am interested in early AR-15 history, interested in guns in general, sometimes build guns, but what I would like to focus on today is probably my biggest pet peeve with AR-15 history, which is the powder change. I will sum up the powder change by saying it's a myth, but usually this myth is justified by sort of some sub-myths, and today I think I would like to make a concise rebuttal of the sort of 5 sub-myths. I will try and overlay sources as I go. My sources will be from the Black Rifle, that's Ed Azel's book, that's sort of the like the go-to history of the development, testing, and adoption of the AR-15. Additionally, I will be using the M16 Rifle Review Panel report from 1968, mostly just because that's got all of the test data in one place. I'll be using those 2 documents. However, as an additional resource, right, if this makes you guys curious, but you're not necessarily interested in going and doing like big research, like going and reading the books or the test report, Daniel Waters put together a really, really good timeline that goes over the history of 223 and 5.56, the history from its very first inception at the hands of Eugene Stoner, all the way down the road to even stuff that's after early AR-15 history and is more or less outside of my wheelhouse at that point. So I will link to those things in the description and try and overlay links to sites in those sources as we go. However, I want to keep this video concise, and to avoid me getting off in tangents as I am prone to do so, I won't be overlaying sections from the documents themselves, just so we can try and keep this one as concise as possible. So, the powder change myth made up of 5 sub-myths. Those 5 sub-myths are: the powder change was sabotage. The powder change caused the issues that the rifle ended up having. The Army was trying to play favorites with Winchester. They were trying to save costs by reusing artillery powder or reusing powder one way or another. And the final myth, the powder change caused more fouling. It caused the guns to get dirty, right? So these are the 5 myths, and we will address them in that order because it's sort of the easiest way to go. I'll have to avoid prefacing things as much as possible with that. However, before we jump into any of the myths, we do need to have a working understanding of the history of the AR-15's development. Of course, the AR-15, everybody familiar, was developed by Armalite. Eugene Stoner had sort of designed the AR-10, was the chief engineer overseeing the AR-15. Bob Fremont and Jim Sullivan were in charge of the actual design of the AR-15 itself. The gun was designed in a relatively short period of time, and Eugene Stoner designed its cartridge in about 1 month. He specified a powder. So, I mean, to back up even one step further, right? The reason the AR-15 was developed in the first place was because the United States Army Command came to Armalite because they were familiar with Armalite because of the AR-10. They wanted a rifle in a small caliber, high velocity, for their small caliber, high velocity program, right? So it's essentially a 22 caliber rifle with military applications in mind. So they were given an initial list of specifications that were more or less abstract, and those specifications were fleshed out later. Eugene Stoner designs 223 to a more or less foggy set of specifications, and he specifies IMR 4475 is the initial powder. This is a powder he's familiar with because it had been previously used to load 308. He was familiar with loading it for 308 because he had loaded 308 himself before. His previous gun designs, right? Being 308 and 308 being a relatively new cartridge at the time, he was certainly no stranger to what had been used to load 308. So, he takes 4475. The initial velocity requirements change one way or another, but the final velocity requirement is 3250 foot per second at the muzzle in order to penetrate a steel helmet at 500 yards with a 55 grain projectile. That's sort of the genesis of 223. Now, there's actually a big problem here, and that problem was in fact noticed all the way back in 1959, very early on in the AR-15's development, and that was, in order for 4475 to get that velocity with that projectile weight, you have to individual lot certify powders. What this means is that, especially back then, when gunpowder was actually being manufactured before computers especially, that there would be sort of a variance, right? If you put all of the same chemistry in, you did all the same steps and processes, all the temperatures and times were controlled the right way, there'd still be a little bit of a tolerance for actually how fast that powder burns. With IMR 4475, it's a fairly fast powder. In fact, it's faster than what people consider like some magnum pistol powders are actually slower burning. So it's a relatively fast rifle powder, 4475 is. Because 4475 was already on the high end of that sort of pressure burn rate, any powder that deviated upwards of that would be overpressure if it was to get you 3250 foot per second at the muzzle. So, whenever Remington was loading very early 223, they were selecting powder lots from the lower end of that spectrum. They would take 4475 that was on the lower band of that burn rate. This works fine for early adoption and testing. However, it was understood, right? If you're to ramp that production up, this powder will not work for you. However, because this was early development, everybody sort of like turned a blind eye to it, and it became, fell by the wayside, never really got addressed until much later. Now, 1959 to 1962 would see Armalite sell the AR-15s designed to Colt. Colt would see some military contracts with foreign militaries, small-scale ones. They would see the U.S. Air Force get a big contract, and they'd see the rifle be adopted. This whole time, the only ammo that's really available for this rifle is stuff that's individual lot certified 4475, or a couple other IMR powders, a similar composition that also cannot get you the spec velocity. But the Air Force was willing to just sort of let that slide because it wasn't that big of a deal to them, evidently. Now, come 1962, 1963, Department of Defense has stepped in, and they're interested in having the Army go ahead and pick up the AR-15 as well. The Army is resistant to this for a large number of reasons, not the least of which is the fact that they don't even really have a powder that works for this round yet. So the Army is resistant, but the Department of Defense is convinced, and it's kind of Colt's fault that they are so convinced, because Colt keeps saying this is a mature weapon, it's a mature cartridge, everything's ready to go, it's plug and play, maybe you'll have to iron out a couple of wrinkles, and then it'll be ready to go. This was a long way from the truth, as people would end up finding out later. But Department of Defense goes ahead and buys this story. They tell the Army maybe a couple changes will be needed. You can just we'll go ahead and buy a bunch of guns. We'll figure out the issues as the guns are being used. This was a bit of a mistake, and in 1964 that was really laid bare whenever the first big contracts for ammo manufacture came in. Remington was really the one to blow the whistle. Remington, the other manufacturers were refusing to bid on ammo lots that said it has to be 4475 and it has to be 3250 foot per second at the muzzle. Other ammo manufacturers saying, well, we just plain old won't make that, right? We can't do that. Remington was really the one to blow the whistle and say, right, there's pressure concerns here. We can't individual lot certify enough powder quickly enough to get you the ammo in time. So what we're proposing is, why don't we use WC 846? WC 846 is a Winchester designed powder. That's a ball powder as opposed to a stick powder that was used initially. And people will point to this change as being, right, sabotage, right? People will say, well, there's the sabotage, right? They changed the powders. They just up and changed them. Well, again, remember, the reason they changed them is because the original powder was not safe. And we would end up finding, right after Remington's like, well, maybe we should use WC-846. It's not but a couple months later, DuPont actually withdraws 4475 from consideration for future contracts. DuPont, the guys who make money off of when their powder is used, are saying, let's not use our powder anymore. Now, Remington would suggest WC-846. Through a series of events, the Army and the whole committee that's involved with the adoption of the rifle would go and evaluate other powders. They evaluate another DuPont powder. They initially are resistant to evaluating a Winchester powder. However, they finally do let Winchester powder in after Winchester justifies their inclusion. And it turns out that Winchester powder is the best choice. That WC-846 that Remington has suggested, which Remington had already tested some amount of ammo using WC-846, that was decided that was the best go-forward plan. However, the second best option was this IMR powder. We'll end up finding out very quickly, though, that this IMR powder had serious tolerance issues, one ammo lot to the next, and would basically have needed, again, individual lot certification. So this powder is also disqualified by the end of 1964. So there's a gap there, right, where DuPont has withdrawn 4475. There is no approved powder. Finally, this new IMR is approved. Additionally, WC-846 is approved. And then that other IMR is pulled, and you just have WC-846 being approved to go forward through the rest of 1964. There is still an existing supply of that 4475 loaded powder that is still out there. However, WC-846 is now sort of like the de facto standard for the powder. Essentially, right, this covers our first myth. These sets of facts address our first myth entirely. If there was sabotage, right, at least the first two elements you need to prove in sabotage is that there was a willing and intentional attempt to make something fail, in that specifically it failing was the goal, right? So like you can't just make a willing attempt to slow something down. That's like sort of obstruction. Sabotage is something different from obstruction. It's you're trying to get away with something that you hope isn't detected so that it fails, and failing is your goal. Not just a short-term failure, but you're trying to completely stop it. Sabotage isn't there, right? Every step along the way, the Army is lockstep with the Air Force, with Colt, for finding a new powder. They knew that a new powder had to be found because their option, if they don't find a new powder, is, I don't know, the M16's shut down. If the Army was, heart set on having the M14 maybe come back, all they'd have to do is refuse to qualify a new powder. Instead, the whole time the Army is really leading the push to test and qualify a new powder. Because when people talk about it being sabotage, they talk about, well, they didn't even test the powder. They never tested the powder in the rifles it was going to be used in. It's true that in the original test that qualified the replacement powders, they weren't using it in actual M16's, actual AR-15s. They were doing it in sort of universal receiver setups, but they did that so they could measure pressures. If they just put it in the guns and said, looks good to us, that would be substantially more negligent than had they not taken pressure testing data to find what was the most likely powder to work in terms of pressure. So hopefully that sort of like resolves the controversy there, the misunderstanding around it being sabotaged. Simply not the case. It wasn't a unilateral decision. It wasn't something that was just changed overnight and nobody conferred about it. The change was tested, the change was articulated, and they picked the best powder out of the lots to continue with. In fact, they picked the best two, and then it turned out that the second best just was not very good, wasn't going to work out. And again, if you're sabotaging it, why would you pull out the powder that's not that good? Why would you change powders in the first place? Why would you even entertain that if you're interested in sabotaging it? Just have the guns consistently fail to meet velocity, or have guns start blowing up. That's what you do. That's what I'd do if I was trying to sabotage something anyway. So hopefully that sort of addresses the big sabotage angle. The second angle we're going to have to go into a little bit more nuanced discussion for, and that angle is that the change to the powder, the subsequent change, caused all the issues the rifle had. This isn't true, right? There's a kernel of truth at the heart of this one. There were more issues numerically that happened after the powder change. However, attributing all of these to the powder change is not only hasty, it's probably just outright wrong. You can go ahead, as I have, and go and dig through the entire 6th appendix to the rifle review panel. The impression that I got after reading that was, okay, so the powder change really didn't make a big of a difference, and in fact, it actually reduced some failures. The more severe failures the rifle was having, the powder change actually resolved, right? It made them happen less. But we'll talk about some of those those reports and their data in one moment. However, it's first important for us to understand how the AR-15 actually works. We have here a sort of period correct, right? It's a 66, 67 Colt SP1. This is obviously not its original bolt carrier, but I decided to throw this bolt carrier in here so that we can have one that looks more like the bolt carrier that we actually need it to look like. Additionally, we will pop our buffer out of this guy. Here we have one stripped down rifle. Now, the way this rifle works is, of course, probably familiar to most of you. However, what we're going to talk about specifically here is the issue of bolt carrier bounce. Bolt carrier bounce was a problem with the AR-15 from the very get-go. In fact, Colt was so aware of this problem in 1963 that they go about designing an improved buffer for the AR-15, which of course is this one. And they designed this buffer because even with the IMR powder, even before there was an approval to load a different powder, the AR-15 did have bolt bounce problems, and Colt was already interested in solving them. Now, why did these bolt bounce problems exist? Well, it's sort of a two-part thing. First off has to do with the relative weights of the parts in the AR-15 system. The second part has more to do with the sort of geometry, right, the actual shape that these parts take. Now, compared to an AK, and AKs can sometimes have bolt bounce, don't get me wrong, that does still happen with AKs. AKs have an action spring that's above the sort of center of mass of your reciprocating parts. So whenever the AK's carrier comes to a stop, its tendency is to do this. Meanwhile, in the AR-15, you have an inline recoil system. You have this going on. Whenever these parts come forward, there's not really a tendency for them to do this. In fact, they can't really do this at all. They come forward, and when they want to bounce backwards. Meanwhile, in the AK, while it still sort of wants to bounce backwards, it bounces backwards like this. The carrier bounces back into the rails, and the carrier just really doesn't bounce very far at all. I'll try and put slow-mo footage of an AK carrier and then slow-mo footage of bolt bounce in an AR to sort of give you guys an idea of what actually that looks like. The AR-15, especially early on with its lightweight buffer, suffered pretty severely from bolt bounce. Now, for those of you who only exclusively shoot semi-auto, bolt bounce in an AR-15 really doesn't matter, right? Just like in a 10-22. The 10-22 bolt bounce is extremely bad. However, it being a semi-auto, that's not really a problem. If you do convert a 10-22 to full auto, you will have big problems with the bolt bounce. Similarly, bolt bounce in the AR-15 was a massive problem because of how the auto-sear actually worked. This trip on the carrier will come forward to trip the auto-sear, and that releases the hammer. But if whenever your bolt comes into lock, the first thing it does is lock, and then immediately the carrier bounces backwards, the firing pin can no longer get out the front of the bolt face. So the hammer hits it right now, the hammer hits the firing pin whenever the carrier is like this, and the carrier bounces back forward. So what does that mean? You didn't set off your next round. This is the bolt bounce problem in the AR-15 explained. Because it is a linear system, of course you've got your gas tapped off here. The reason I took off the handguard is to show you the gas tube. Gas comes back here, gas comes inside the gas key, gas gets ported through the gas key down into the bolt carrier, between the bolt carrier and the bolt. It pushes the bolt head forward and the bolt carrier backwards, right? Then that cycles it back to here with the buffer. And then the spring pushes on the buffer, pushes on the bolt to bring the bolt back forward. And whenever the bolt comes home, it will rotate and slam shut like that. But if there isn't sufficient weight or a sufficient rattly dead blow system in the buffer, because it is all in line, the tendency will be for the bolt carrier to then bounce back. And the bolt carrier on its way forward will trip the auto sear right here, and then it will bounce backwards. This will so this is bouncing backwards into the hammer. The hammer hits the shrouded firing pin, doesn't actually set a round off by the time it closes. There is your bolt bounce problem in the AR-15. This problem existed before there was a powder change, right? In fact, it was the original buffer was the big problem. This improved buffer more or less solved that by being heavier, right? Because a heavier buffer just tends to resist bolt bounce in general. However, this buffer also has a little bit of a dead blow system. Once this buffer comes all the way back, the weights in it get shifted to the rear. As it comes forward on the spring, the weight stays shifted to the rear until this comes to a stop, and then the weight shifts forward. And that slight dead blow effect is all it takes to prevent this thing then from having the bolt carrier bounce issue. So, Colt was aware of this with the original buffer design. The original buffer design was, Eugene Stoner sort of came up with the idea, and then Fremont and Sullivan, mixed it up into the size that it would be in the AR-15. But it is to blame for these bolt bounce issues more so than anything else, right? Because even with the original ammo, these issues did still exist. Colt found this out in 1963. And Colt really found this out by moving to a heavier barrel version of this AR-15 M16 system. They more or less went and put a bull barrel underneath the handguard, and the thing that they learned was the rifle then consistently bolt bounces, because the heavier your actual gun is, the more likely bolt bounce will be to happen, all else being equal, because ordinarily whenever the bolt slugs forward, the gun will slug forward a little bit with it, and that energy doesn't get to be put back into the carrier to let it bounce. But if your gun's really heavy, all of the bolt carrier is going to slam into the gun, the gun's not going to want to move, and the bolt carrier is going to want to bounce off of it. So again, it's a balancing of weights, and it's a fact of geometry. The AR-15 is prone to bolt bounce. This was known. This was something Colt was working on addressing. This was something that the powder change didn't cause. It was always there, but the powder change did make this substantially worse. The reason for this is because while the new powder that they specified had a lower chamber pressure and could still get the peak velocities, it had more gas pressure out here at the gas block because it was slower burning. So more pressure here means more pressure here, more pressure here, more pressure here, means there's a more violent force pulling the bolt carrier open whenever the gun fires. Now, as we understand AR-15s today, this is pretty normal. We expect this, right? If you shoot something like really hot loaded 5.56, the gun will cycle more violently than if you shoot it with steel case 223. The reason for this is, of course, difference of pressure at the gas port. With the modern buffer, modern setup, this gun can handle a pretty wide variety of ammo. Stuff that's loaded like 3,100 foot per second at the muzzle to stuff that's 3,300 foot per second at the muzzle. It can handle a pretty wide variety of pressures and velocities in its system. However, if you have an underweight buffer that doesn't actually really do any buffering, it's really just sort of there as like a stick that has rings in it that end up sticking together, and then it just becomes like a solid rod that weighs too little for the gun's ideal system, this will end up causing you all sorts of problems. And those were the problems that were then revealed, laid totally bare by the increase in energy from the higher gas pressure from the respecified powder, the new powder. So these issues were known. The bolt bounce was known. Colt was already working on solving the bolt bounce. what issues did this then change in powder cause? If you go and look through all of the test data, the big issues that it sort of caused was again, failures to fire, and we know why that is. And it would sometimes, well, I believe it actually sum total, it decreased failures to feed, which is somewhat funny. Then you can go and look through the Appendix 6 to sort of see the exact what had changed and what had not changed. But on balance, really the only thing that got substantially worse was bolt bounce and bolt bounce related failures got more common with the powder change. Several other failures, including severe ones like failures to extract and failures to eject, actually decreased, which is very interesting and worth paying attention to. Again, you've got more energy cycling in the gun. These sorts of issues can actually end up being resolved. Now, this isn't to say that the AR-15s didn't have issues with extraction and ejection, but these issues end up going away whenever the chambers are chrome lined and whenever cleaning kits are available for the gun. And it's important to remember, and I probably should have prefaced earlier, the bad powder, the one that they switched to, the one that caused all the problems, is the same powder that we use to this day. Not quite the same powder, they ended up tweaking some like sub-ingredients, but the burn rates and the pressures of Lake City 5.56 that you buy today is the same as the 223 loaded with WC-846 all the way back then. Sort of the the pressure specs for AR-15s and their burn rates and their ammo was built around WC-846 because it was really the first powder that could get you the velocity you needed at a safe pressure. So there's the genesis, right? There's where it comes from. So it's really hard to say that this is the bad powder because in reality it replaces a powder that couldn't even, the powder that couldn't even be qualified, right? Because it couldn't do it right. This powder sort of solves that issue. And I think that more or less covers what I wanted to say as far as myth 2, that the powder caused the issues. Well, no, the underweight buffer, underweight and poorly designed buffer really was the cause of the issues that you could attribute to the powder, because of course a properly designed buffer just doesn't have those issues. And the other issues that the AR-15 had, at least most of them anyway, ended up decreasing in number as a result of the powder change, because having that increased cycling energy was actually better for the gun on balance. So, with those out of the way, we can sort of move on to myth 3, which was that the Army was trying to play favorites with Winchester. So the important thing to think about here is we sort of really covered all of the facts we need to already, that Winchester had to explain their way into 846 being considered in the first place. Also, at that time, the TCC had approved a DuPont powder that wasn't IMR, but it was a stick powder, right? So there at the initial powder change, they approved 2 different powders, right? One's the Winchester, one's the Olin. The Winchester one had to go above and beyond to explain why they should even be considered. That's not what favoritism looks like to me. Additionally, after WC-846 becomes the sole powder, if you liked Winchester and you're trying to play favorites with Winchester, you'd do everything you could to prevent another powder from being looked at, evaluated, or qualified. However, multiple times they go and look again for alternative powders. They look for alternative powders, more than after they just made the one change. And again, if you look at, back to myth number 1, if it's sabotage, why would you change away from the bad powder? You wouldn't. And yet they were still trying to find other sources because they didn't want to be left with just one source. They wanted to make sure they found the best possible powder. And we'll talk more about trials that were undertaken to evaluate these other alternative powders. Again, myth number 1. Plainly not a thing. Playing favoritism with Winchester, it's plainly not a thing, and it's not supportable whatsoever. Our next myth is the one about cost savings. This usually takes one of 2 forms. It's either that, well, they switched powders, but it was only so they could reuse a powder that was already used in 308, or they switched powders to reuse an artillery powder from World War II. There's a kernel of truth to both of these, and in fact, the first is actually just straight up true. They did evaluate a powder that had been used to load 308, and they went ahead and went with it. However, 4475 was also used to load 308, so the good powder, the original powder that was actually not safe, it was also used to load 308. And so was WC-846, and WC-846 was not selected because it would be cheaper. In fact, in all of the analysis that I have ever read from Frankfurt Arsenal and their initial testing of replacement powders, not a single time do they even consider cost or availability. They're just looking at what would be the best mechanical match to the system. So, oops, that one's out the window. The second part of that one then is the artillery powder. Where did that come from? So, in general, right, the best way to understand this one is that there's a thing in gunpowder known as recycling. Of course, the active ingredient sort of the hardest and least safe one to synthesize in gunpowder is generally nitrocellulose. It's the explosive part of gunpowder. Nitrocellulose is soluble. You can get it out of gunpowder and then reuse it in another place. Winchester, and in fact, really any powder manufacturer that had lots of ammo from World War II that they weren't going to be using anymore, would recycle the nitrocellulose out of it, because why wouldn't you, right? And while recycling can introduce impurities and cause problems, inconsistencies, and burn rates, consistently we see that WC-846 was not having lot-to-lot problems, and in fact was very consistent and was preferred for its consistency. If you remember, the second stick powder that was approved, right when there was two powders approved, it was WC-846 and this other stick powder. The other stick powder was pulled because it wasn't consistent, which means that they were checking for consistency. And WC-846, which was to some extent using recycled powder, or recycled nitrocellulose, was consistent. So that's just more or less straight out the window. So like maybe there were cost savings that happened, but the powder was not selected. The powder was not changed to do a cost savings. There was no McNamara and his whiz kids pulled out a calculator and they picked the cheapest powder. This did not happen. And it is important to emphasize that this is probably the most oft repeated one, that they recycled powders or had to use the powders that was left over. And in fact, there's a Forgotten Weapons video where he just straight up says, well, the reason they changed powder was to use M14 powder. It's not true. This is not a thing. It's true that this powder was also used to load 308, and it's true that they had stockpiles of this powder lying around. This was also true with 4475. The problem with 4475, though, was if this is your stockpile, this is how much you could actually use to load 223, and this is how much you need. In fact, they needed more than the stockpile 4475 that already existed. So, no, to put that one to rest, it's absolutely not the case. And then our last myth to sort of cover here is that the powder change caused more fouling. This is a very tricky one and involves an awful lot of detailed analysis. It's one that my own opinion, my own understanding of has changed multiple times over as I research more. Sort of the two key things to look at here are, there's the USA TCOM, I believe that's how it's pronounced, it's a big old acronym. There was a series of tests that took place with the original buffer with two different powders. They were comparing the WC-846 powder to a different IMR powder. It was not the 4475 IMR powder. I believe it was 8208 IMR powder. A different kind of IMR powder, and if you look at an overall burn rate chart, 8208 sits more or less between WC-846 and the original 4475, so it sort of splits the difference in burn rate. So, an analysis of this powder was done. The thing that was found was 8208, which was selected as a replacement, has an even higher port pressure. Even higher pressure out here than did WC-846. So the bolt bounce problems that existed were going to exist more so because you've got even more energy cycling the action. Additionally, the chamber pressures were pretty close to in line. Between the two of them, it was more or less within margin of error, but there was a slight increase in port pressure with the 8208. So these USA TCOM tests were sort of set up to evaluate the performance of these two powders side by side with each other. I think there was another powder that was included, but it was just awful. And in fact, it may have been the HPC 10 that we'd seen even earlier on. So the two main contenders, right, WC-846 and our IMR 8208. The end result of these trials will be that 8208 is cleaner burning, it's more reliable. However, whenever you go and interrogate the data about these tests, you'll find that the only reason that 8208 looks like it's doing better is because it had many less failures to eject. If you go and look at the actual rifle-by-rifle breakdown of the data from this test, there were 3 rifles that were used to test WC-846 and 2 rifles used to test 8208. One of the rifles used to test WC-846 had consistent failure to eject problems. The other 2 didn't. So I think what we can conclude from this is there may have been a lemon rifle there in the batch because there was only one rifle that behaved this way with WC-846. At the very least, what we can say is that this test data is maybe a little bit untrustworthy, but might show some favor towards 8208, and that 8208 was warranted for further use. I believe these tests took place in 1966. However, by 1968, there was another series of tests ordered, and these tests, as opposed to being in a controlled, flat-range condition, were going to be done in sandy conditions, in jungle conditions, in wet conditions, in moist, humid conditions, and the aim of that was to test how the improved rifles with the new buffer and with chromed chambers would perform in Vietnam-like conditions, right? This is the first time that there's going to be a accurate representation of conditions that's going to be taken into consideration for the rifles. And the end result there is an unequivocal sign that WC-846 across even substantially more rifles were tested in the Panama tests. and they were tested harder, and they were tested in more accurate conditions. And the end result was that WC846 is not just more reliable, but under endurance testing is more reliable. And then very curiously, they'd also found that the chrome chambers actually decrease reliability with regards to failures to extract and failures to eject. And this was not, they even specifically said, we can't explain why this is. And they noted that the discrepancy was worse whenever the chambers were clean. So a clean chrome chamber was less reliable than a clean chrome chamber was less reliable than a clean non-chrome chamber. But by the time that they were dirtied, it was both pretty comparable. Certainly interesting results we saw there, but the result of the Panama test was that WC846 was the right powder for the rifle, especially after it had had its improvements, right? A buffer that's not too light and has a dead blow effect. And that the go-forward plan should be WC846 all the way. 8208 ammo after the Panama trials ends up being pulled from use, right? It's sort of disqualified at that point, and WC846 becomes the de facto powder. Later on down the road, there'll be some tweaks to WC846. They'll end up quibbling over calcium content and these sorts of things. But the thing to realize here is that from a high-level timeline standpoint, the original powder is no good, right? It's just not suitable. You can't have enough of it. Also, it's not safe and can't get you the ballistics you want. So you accept a round that's less effective or a round that's going to blow up your gun, right? Neither of these are acceptable options. So that's why the powder is pushed to the side and a new replacement is evaluated. Two replacements are sort of observed, right? That's our WC846, and the name of the other powder escapes me. It might be like 8326 or something like that. But that powder is almost immediately pulled because it's very inconsistent lot to lot. So WC846 becomes the new standard. WC846 goes forward, and it's tested and evaluated against other powders. It's shown that maybe some other powders might work better than it, but there's a bum rifle in the batch there that seems to be throwing at least a little bit of that data off. And come 1968, we have a comprehensive test of a gun that's got a properly working buffer, a gun that at this point has had its gas port size finalized, it's had its chrome chambers, at this point they've been finalized, it's been committed to. It's got all of the improvements that the rifle's going to see, and WC846 is the right powder for the job. And we have used WC846 or powder with an equivalent burn rate to it since. So whenever people talk about, well, today the AR-15's issues are figured out and it's super reliable, well, the reliable ammo you've shot through it is the ammo that you said was the bad ammo. So what was bad? Certainly not the ammo. The buffer was bad. Other things about the rifle design were a little immature. There was hardnesses that were off here or tolerances that were off there. But the important thing to understand is that's not the ammo's fault. The ammo could never have accounted for that. Unless, again, you use like 4475 or a ammo with a similarly fast burn rate that will let you get away with a light buffer. Oh, but it's also going to be at risk of blowing up if you want the bullets to go as fast as you want. So, hopefully, this gives you guys a little bit more information and a little bit better understanding of the powder change, right? You now know what the powder change was. It was actually a series of changes that were metered and tested and evaluated, and frankly, they could have done better, right? But again, like I mentioned at the beginning, it's important to remember the timeline. That 1964 is when this new powder is approved, and it's by 1966 that they're like, okay, well, we need a new buffer, and it's by 1968 that the rifle's improvements have been figured out. In terms of military procurement, development, and adoption, that's lightning fast. There's almost unheard of levels of fast, and I would like to close this by talking about the fact that we should contrast the AR-15 with the M1 Garand. The M1 Garand was a rifle that similarly advanced in not the same ways the AR-15 was advanced, but advanced in similar ways, or ahead of its time, if you will. But whenever the M1 Garand was in initial production, the rifle was well received with its original ammo, originally loaded, the original rifle, sort of these early low-rate production guns were very well received. Everybody was in love with it, just like with the AR-15. The early guns with those lot-selected ammo, everybody had very positive things to say about it, even though the failure rates were actually kind of high. Everybody still had very positive sorts of things to say about it. However, once they hit high-rate production and were cranking guns out as fast as they could, just like with the M1 Garand, people's impressions and the quality of the guns dropped. In the case of the Garand, there were substantially more failures. In the case of the AR-15, there was actually less failures than early on in testing. However, the failures were increased compared to the guns that were sort of the last off the line at low rate production compared to sort of the first and middle off the line at high rate production. Those earlier low rate guns, or the later low rate guns rather, were substantially more reliable. But similar to the M1 Garand, right? Once they start making more of them, right? Once you actually have to start making the gun, you're going to expose all sorts of issues with the gun's design. The Garand, it took a good 5-10 years to figure this out, right? Remember, the Garand's original gas system was like some cockamamie made up nonsense. And they end up having to resign several core parts of the gun in order to account for a better designed gas system. Now, the AR-15 didn't need quite as much redesign going on with its core mechanism, but it did need some. And this is normal. This is something that all guns have to do. If the M1 Garand had been adopted before World War I, right at the cusp of World War I, and we went into service with it, everybody would talk about how bad and awful the Garand was, but then it got fixed, the way they do with the AR-15. The unfortunate thing here with its powder change and with its design changes and with its design flaws that had to be fixed is that they got exposed. 1964, everybody was like, hey, or at least the Army was like trying to blow the whistle, like, we know these issues exist, we should probably fix them. Department of Defense was like, nah, it's an off-the-shelf purchase, it'll be great, we won't even use it for that long. 1965, we're in a hot war in Vietnam. 1966, we're like heavily involved in a hot war in Vietnam. And by then, it's sort of too late, and you're solving the rifle's issues live on air, if you were. So that's probably the most important takeaway, is that, like I've talked about before, sabotage isn't an element. Unfortunate timing absolutely is. The powder change was not sabotage. The powder change wasn't a bad idea. The powder change wasn't to blame for the rifle's issues. Other things were. The powder change did expose some of these other issues, but fixing the rifle's design flaws lets it use essentially whatever powder you're trying to throw in there. Where Steel Case 223 has gas port pressures pretty darn similar to the original IMR 4475, right? The weak stuff. And it'll cycle with the setup. So will the new stuff, right? So will the modern Lake City stuff that has an equivalent burn rate to WC 846. So there's your lesson. There's your understanding of the powder change. Hopefully, this video has clarified some of those things to you guys, and hopefully probably, if you take nothing else away from this, hopefully the thing that you take away is, with most of the early AR-15 adoption lore, there's like the common held truth, which is just like a total bastardized misunderstanding of the way things actually are. And getting to the way things actually are requires a lot of research and a lot of understanding. So I hope that I've been able to share and articulate that pretty well with you guys here, so that you can now go forth and understand the powder change better. And next time you see somebody on Reddit or whatever going like, they changed the powder and it made the rifle bad, you can go, actually, it's very, very different than that. But I guess if you guys have enjoyed this video, at some point I do want to get around to doing videos about sort of the other, quote-unquote issues that the rifle had, right? Some of the other myths surrounding its adoption and the issues that it ran into. But this is the big one. The powder change is the big one. Adding chrome to stuff is not nearly as misunderstood as certainly the powder change, the subsequent change to the ammo. But I do want to close out here by saying that I don't want you to take this video to mean that there weren't bigger problems, that there weren't big problems with the AR-15, its ammo itself, because there was, right? And it wasn't really in the powder, but there wasn't a brass hardness spec, and that was a big problem. We don't even know how big of a problem that played, because nobody was even measuring brass hardness until after somebody was like, hey, have we been measuring brass hardness? And they're like, no. And they're like, well, do you think that any of the ripped off case rims could have to do with how hard the brass is? And somebody's like, yeah. And at that point, they end up developing a hardness spec there. There wasn't a gas port spec early on, right? The rifle did have problems. Most of those were just due to immaturity. Most of those were due to a rushed adoption. Most of those are due to the fact that the U.S. military did not know how to do an off-the-shelf buy. They didn't know how to set requirements for something that somebody else had designed, that they don't know how well it was actually designed or how well it's actually been tested. So these were all the growing pains, and these were all things that, unfortunate circumstances that befell the AR-15. And the fact that it rose above them, and not just rose above them, but like massively exceeded even the optimistic expectations for the rifle that Colt had. It went in well exceeded. It's a really cool thing, and I think that's part of the reason that I'm so in love with the AR-15 story, is that it came from such unfortunate circumstances, left and right, its whole early history, and it still matured into the fine wine that it is today. Unless you're an AK guy and you hate it, and that's all right. That's okay too. But anyway, I've got a Patreon if you guys want to sort of support me as I think about making more videos like this. Certainly I'd like to do one about the chrome lining at some point at the very least. But this is it. That's been the powder change video. A very concise, probably like 40-minute video, because it's hard to give you guys an understanding. If I just give you guys the drive-through version, you won't understand it very well. So I have to give you the short, long-form version, if that makes sense. Anyway, I will see you guys next time, and I hope you enjoy.